Princess Anne walked into one of Buckingham Palace's most restricted private wings and found an intruder standing in the... Princess Anne is stepping back. Catherine is stepping forward. What does it mean when one woman yields and another rises? How does that quiet exchange of roles rewrite centuries of expectation? This subtle handover between two of the monarchy's most formidable figures is not just a change of faces. It's a recalibration of power, priorities, and the story the British crown will tell next. Small gestures, private decisions, and reclaimed public moments are already redrawing the map of influence at the palace. Stay with me. The rest of this story explains who's really in control, what they're willing to change, and why every move matters. Anne's final act and what it signals. There are transitions within the British royal family that happen loudly, announced through official press releases and celebrated with the kind of carefully managed public ceremony that the palace deploys when it wants to control the narrative around a significant change. And then there are transitions that happen quietly, communicated through the subtler language of adjusted schedules, scaled-back commitments, and the kind of deliberate repositioning that those who understand the internal dynamics of the monarchy recognize immediately as something far more significant than its surface appearance suggests. Princess Anne's decision to step back from a key element of her public duties in the early months of 2025 belongs firmly in the second category. It arrived without fanfare, it was acknowledged without elaboration, and it has produced within the inner circles of the royal family and among those who observe the institution most closely a level of quiet but sustained attention that reflects a precise understanding of what it actually represents. Princess Anne has been, for the better part of 5 decades, the most relentlessly hardworking member of the British royal family by almost any measurable standard. The figures associated with her public duties over the years are, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinary. Hundreds of engagements annually, sustained across a period of royal service that has outlasted the careers of most of the politicians, diplomats, and institutional figures she has worked alongside throughout her extraordinary professional life. She has carried out her duties with a consistency and a commitment that even those who have occasionally found her manner abrasive have never seriously questioned. Work, for Anne, has never been a performance of royal obligation. It has been the expression of a deeply held and deeply personal understanding of what the position she was born into requires of the person who holds it, which is precisely why her decision to step back from any element of that work carries a significance that cannot be reduced to the practical management of a senior royal's schedule. The specific public duty from which Anne is withdrawing is one that has placed her at the center of a particular strand of the monarchy's institutional life for many years. It is a role whose demands have required sustained physical presence, extensive travel, and the kind of consistent personal engagement that a woman in her mid-70s, however remarkable her energy and her constitution, can no longer be expected to maintain at the level she has historically set for herself. Those around Anne are careful, in their public characterizations of the decision, to frame it primarily in those terms, as a sensible and overdue acknowledgement of the physical realities of age by a woman who has given more of herself to royal service than almost anyone in the history of the modern monarchy. That framing is not inaccurate, but it is, according to those with genuine knowledge of the thinking behind the decision, significantly incomplete, because alongside the straightforwardly practical dimensions of Anne's withdrawal, sources say, runs a second and considerably more deliberate intention. The Princess Royal has not simply decided that the time has come to reduce the physical demands she places on herself. She has decided, with the characteristic thoroughness that marks every significant decision she makes, that the time has come to actively facilitate a transition in the institutional landscape of the royal family that she has been thinking about for a considerable period. And the central element of that transition is the deliberate creation of space in the specific areas of royal life where her own presence has historically been most dominant for Catherine, Princess of Wales, to step into a position of visibility and authority that the continued presence of someone of Anne's stature and experience would inevitably complicate. That reading of Anne's decision is one that those closest to her neither confirm nor deny directly, which is itself a form of confirmation within the careful language of royal insider communication. What they do say, with a consistency that reflects a shared understanding of the situation, is that Anne's relationship with Catherine has developed over the past several years into something considerably more substantive than the formal cordiality that characterizes most relationships between senior royals and their younger counterparts. There is, insiders say, a genuine mutual regard between these two women that has its roots in a shared set of values about what the monarchy is for and what the people who represent it are required to bring to that representation. And it is that shared foundation, more than any formal arrangement or explicit agreement, that has shaped the timing and the manner of Anne's withdrawal. The signal that Anne's decision sends within the royal household is being read by those with the experience and the proximity to read it accurately as one of the clearest and most consequential the Princess Royal has ever sent. Anne does not make institutional gestures carelessly. She does not adjust the architecture of her public life without understanding precisely what message that adjustment carries and to whom it will be most legible. The decision to step back at this particular moment, during a period in which the royal family is navigating a degree of internal tension and institutional uncertainty that has rarely been more visible, is understood by those watching from the inside as a deliberate act of institutional positioning. Anne is not simply retiring from a duty. She is designating a successor, and the woman she is designating, the manner in which that designation is being communicated, and what it means for the future of the monarchy, are questions whose answers will reshape the royal family in ways that are only beginning to become clear. Understanding those answers requires understanding what Catherine has become within the institution, and what the specific journey of the past several years has done to prepare her for the role that Anne is now, with characteristic decisiveness and characteristic quiet, stepping aside to allow her to fill. Catherine's rise and the moment. Everything changed. There is a version of Catherine, Princess of Wales, that the public formed its first impressions of in the years following her marriage to Prince William in April of 2011. She was young, beautiful, and carefully managed. Her public appearances were precisely choreographed. Her statements were measured to the point of revealing almost nothing of the person behind them. Her style attracted enormous attention, and her presence generated genuine public warmth. But beneath the enthusiasm she inspired in the crowds that gathered to see her, there ran a persistent question among those who observed the royal family closely, about whether the woman behind the carefully maintained public image possessed the substance, the resilience, and the institutional depth that the role she had married into would eventually demand of her. That question has been answered. It has been answered not through any single dramatic moment, but through a series of developments that have collectively transformed Catherine from a carefully managed royal newcomer into the most consequential female figure in the modern monarchy. And the transformation is one that those who asked the original question most skeptically have been among the first to acknowledge. The process that produced that transformation was not a comfortable one. Comfort, inside the British royal family, has a long history of producing people who are pleasant and presentable without ever becoming genuinely formidable. What produces formidable people, within the particular pressures of the royal world, is the sustained encounter with difficulty, with the kind of challenge that cannot be managed through the usual tools of careful positioning and polished public presentation. Catherine has had that encounter in a form and at an intensity that very few members of the royal family in the modern era have been required to match. The years of public scrutiny that preceded and followed her marriage tested her composure and her resilience in ways that were visible to everyone watching. The internal family conflicts that erupted most publicly around Harry and Meghan's departure required her to navigate extraordinarily charged personal and institutional territory, with a steadiness that those who understand how difficult that navigation actually was have consistently underestimated in their public assessments of it. But it was her own health crisis, the cancer diagnosis she revealed publicly in March of 2024, that produced the most significant shift in Catherine's standing within the institution, and within the broader public understanding of who she is. The manner in which she managed that period, the privacy she maintained around her treatment, the dignity with which she eventually chose to share her diagnosis, and the composure she projected in the video statement through which she made that disclosure, communicated something about her character that no amount of carefully choreographed public appearances could have conveyed. It communicated that the woman behind the image was someone capable of carrying genuine weight without being broken by it. And within the royal family, where the capacity to carry weight without breaking is the most fundamental qualification for leadership, That communication landed with a force that those who witnessed its impact on the internal dynamics of the household described as decisive. The response within the institution to Catherine's handling of her illness was, according to sources, one of the most significant recalibrations of assessment that those observing the royal family's internal dynamics have witnessed in years. Senior figures who had always regarded her with a degree of the cautious reserve that the royal family extends by default to those who have married into it, rather than being born to it, found their assessments shifting in ways they were prepared, in private, to acknowledge explicitly. Princess Anne's response is the one that sources discuss most often in this context. Anne is not a woman who revises her judgments of people quickly or without substantial evidence. Her assessment of Catherine in the years following the marriage had been, by the accounts of those familiar with it, a genuinely interested but carefully qualified one. She saw the qualities. She also saw the untested dimensions. What Catherine's management of her illness provided was the evidence that those untested dimensions could meet the standard that Anne, more than any other senior royal, holds as the baseline of genuine royal seriousness. The specific moments in Catherine's recent trajectory that signal her readiness to lead are identified by sources as both personal and institutional in character. On a personal level, the health crisis and its aftermath have produced in her a clarity of purpose and a groundedness of self-understanding that those who have spent time with her since her recovery describe as qualitatively different from the careful composure she projected in the earlier years of her royal life. She knows now, in a way that can only be learned through the particular education of serious illness, what matters and what does not. She knows the difference between the performance of strength and the actual possession of it. And she knows that she possesses it, which is a knowledge that changes the way a person moves through the world and the way the world responds to them. On the institutional level, the evidence of Catherine's readiness is visible in the evolution of her public work and the manner in which she has approached the responsibilities associated with her position over the past 18 months. The early childhood development initiative that she has championed, with a depth of personal commitment and intellectual seriousness that has surprised even sympathetic observers, reflects a capacity for sustained institutional focus that goes well beyond the requirements of traditional royal patronage. She has not simply lent her name and her presence to a cause. She has engaged with its substance, mastered its evidence base, and used the platform of her position to push for the kind of genuine policy engagement that the monarchy has historically been reluctant to pursue for fear of the political complications it can generate. That willingness to use the platform seriously, combined with the personal resilience her illness demonstrated, and the institutional judgment her navigation of the family's internal conflicts has revealed, is what has produced in those around her the growing conviction that Catherine is not simply ready to fill the space Anne is creating. She was, in ways that are only now becoming fully visible, already filling it. Anne and Catherine, a relationship. Built in private. There are relationships within the British royal family that exist almost entirely outside the public record. They do not generate the kind of coverage that attaches to the more visible and more volatile dynamics within the institution. They are not the subject of breathless insider accounts or carefully placed media stories designed to shape public perception of where the lines of affection and alliance within the family are currently drawn. They develop instead in the private spaces of a world that is rarely as accessible to outside observation as those who report on it most enthusiastically tend to suggest. The relationship between Princess Anne and Catherine, Princess of Wales, is one of those relationships. It has been built quietly over a period of years, in the particular kind of private space that the royal family creates when it is not performing itself for an audience. And what has been built there, sources say, is something considerably more substantive and considerably more significant than the public record of their interactions has ever fully reflected. The earliest years of Catherine's membership of the royal family were not, by the accounts of those who observed the dynamic from within, characterized by any particular closeness between her and Anne. That is not to say they were marked by tension or by the kind of visible reserve that signals a relationship navigating active difficulty. They were simply distant in the way that relationships between people at very different stages of the same institutional life, and with very different histories within it, naturally tend to be in their initial period. Anne was, when Catherine married William in 2011, already 4 decades into a royal career of formidable distinction. She had seen a great deal of the royal world, had formed her views about it with the thoroughness that characterizes everything she does, and had developed over those decades the particular quality of restrained assessment that she extends to new entrants into the institution, regardless of who they are or what promise they show. Catherine was new, and newness within Anne's framework of judgment is something to be observed carefully rather than embraced enthusiastically. What changed the dynamic between them was not a single conversation or a single shared experience, but a gradual accumulation of evidence that Catherine was not simply navigating the demands of royal life adequately, but was developing towards something more serious and more consequential than adequate navigation. Anne is described by those who know her well as someone who responds to the demonstration of genuine quality with a warmth and a generosity that her public reputation for severity does not always lead people to anticipate. She is exacting in her standards precisely because she believes the institution deserves people who meet them. And when she encounters someone who is in the process of meeting them, her response is one of genuine and active engagement rather than the cautious, qualified regard she extends by default. The evidence that began to shift Anne's assessment of Catherine is described by sources as arriving in stages. The early childhood development work was one significant data point. Anne has, throughout her long royal career, maintained a deep personal skepticism of royal patronage that is more performative than substantive. She has seen enough examples of senior royals lending their names and their presence to causes without engaging seriously with the substance of those causes to have developed a clear and unsparing internal distinction between the two modes of royal engagement. When she observed Catherine's approach to the early childhood initiative, the depth of her preparation, the seriousness of her engagement with the evidence, and the consistency of her commitment to pushing the work beyond the boundaries of what traditional royal patronage requires, it registered with Anne as genuine substance rather than performance. And genuine substance, in Anne's assessment, is both rare and worth acknowledging. The health crisis of 2024 deepened the shift that the substantive work had begun. Sources who have observed Anne's response to Catherine's management of her illness describe a significant moment of reassessment in the Princess Royal's understanding of who Catherine is and what she is capable of. Anne has, in her own life, faced serious physical challenges with the kind of private stoicism that she regards as the appropriate response to difficulty within the context of royal service. She has never sought public sympathy for the physical demands of her extraordinary working life, and she has little patience for those who do. But the manner in which Catherine managed her illness, the privacy she maintained, the dignity she sustained, and the composure she brought to the eventual public disclosure of her diagnosis reflected an approach to personal difficulty that Anne recognized as belonging to the same tradition of private stoicism that she herself has always embodied. It was in the period following Catherine's recovery that the relationship between the two women moved, sources say, from the territory of mutual regard and shared institutional values into something more actively collaborative. Anne began, in the particular and deliberate way that marks her most significant private engagements, to make herself available to Catherine in ways that went beyond the formal interactions of shared public duties. Private conversations that sources describe as substantive, candid, and characterized by the kind of frank exchange of views that Anne reserves for people whose judgment she genuinely respects. Observations about the institution, its history, its internal dynamics, and the specific challenges that the current period presents for those who are responsible for its future. The kind of knowledge that is accumulated over decades of lived royal experience and that cannot be acquired through any other means, passed from a woman who has spent 50 years inside the institution to the woman she has concluded is best positioned to use it well. Those who have been close enough to observe the evolution of this private relationship describe it as having a quality of intentionality on Anne's side that distinguishes it from the organic development of personal affinity. She is not simply enjoying the company of a younger woman whose qualities she admires. She is, in the characteristic way, of someone who thinks always about the institution rather than simply about the personal, investing in a relationship that she understands to have significance beyond its immediate dimensions. She is preparing Catherine, equipping her with the understanding and the perspective that the role she is moving toward will require, and doing so with the quiet, deliberate generosity of someone who has decided that the most important contribution she can make to the institution she has served for 50 years is to ensure that the person who follows her into its most demanding spaces is as fully prepared as it is within her power to make her. What leading the family actually means. There is a tendency in the public discussion of the British royal family to speak about leadership within the institution in terms that are more metaphorical than precise. To describe a particular royal as the family's anchor, or its moral compass, or its most powerful female figure, without attending carefully to what those descriptions actually mean in the specific institutional context of a monarchy, whose formal structures, informal dynamics, and unwritten codes of conduct are considerably more complex than the romantic language of royal coverage tends to suggest. When insiders speak about Catherine moving into a position of genuine leadership within the royal family, they are not speaking in metaphors. They are describing a set of specific responsibilities, specific relationships, and specific institutional functions that carry real consequences for the way the monarchy operates, and that require from the person who holds them a particular combination of qualities that are far rarer within the institution than the supply of people willing to perform the surface appearance of leadership might suggest. What leading the family actually means, in the practical terms that matter most to those who inhabit the royal world, begins with the question of who sets the tone. Within any institution, and the monarchy is no exception to this, there are formal hierarchies of authority, and there are informal hierarchies of influence. The formal hierarchy of the British royal family is defined by the order of succession and the distribution of official roles and titles. It places the king at its apex and distributes authority downward through a structure that is, in its formal dimensions, relatively clear. But the informal hierarchy, the one that determines whose judgment is sought in moments of genuine difficulty, whose perspective shapes the way the family understands itself and its responsibilities, and whose conduct sets the standard against which others within the institution measure their own behavior, does not map neatly onto the formal one. It is determined by something less tangible and more consequential, by the accumulated evidence of character, judgment, and commitment that produces in those around a particular individual the instinct to defer to that individual's example, even when no formal obligation to do so exists. Princess Anne has occupied the apex of that informal hierarchy among the women of the royal family for most of the past 3 decades. Not because she was born to it, though her birth position is relevant to the authority she commands, and not because it was formally assigned to her, because it was not. She occupied it because she earned it, through the relentless accumulation of evidence that her judgment was sound, her commitment was genuine, and her understanding of what the institution required was more penetrating and more reliable than that of almost anyone around her. The question of what it means for Catherine to move into that position is therefore inseparable from the question of what Anne's occupancy of it has actually consisted of, and what its loss will mean for the way the family navigates the challenges that now face it. One of the most significant practical dimensions of the leadership role Catherine is moving toward is what sources describe as the function of institutional memory within a living conversation. Anne has been, for the senior members of the royal family, and for the network of trusted advisors and institutional figures who support the functioning of the monarchy, a person whose understanding of the institution's history, its internal dynamics, and the precedents that govern its most sensitive decisions is both extraordinarily deep and extraordinarily accessible. When difficult situations arise within the family, questions about how similar situations have been navigated in the past, about what the institution's established conventions require in circumstances of a particular kind, and about where the boundaries of acceptable conduct within the royal world are genuinely drawn, Anne has been the person those questions are brought to. Her answers have carried authority not because she has formal power over those who seek them, but because the depth and the accuracy of her institutional knowledge are beyond reasonable challenge. Catherine cannot yet match that depth of institutional knowledge. No one who has been a member of the royal family for 14 years can match the accumulated understanding of someone who has been part of it for more than 50. But sources say that what Anne has been doing in the private conversations of the past several years has been a systematic and deliberate attempt to close that gap as much as it is possible to close it within the time available. The sharing of institutional knowledge, historical perspective, and the particular understanding of internal family dynamics that only someone with Anne's combination of longevity and intelligence could possess has been, insiders say, one of the most significant dimensions of the relationship the two women have built. It has not made Catherine Anne's equal in institutional depth, but it has given her access to a quality and a breadth of understanding about the institution she serves that would otherwise have taken decades more experience to acquire. The second major dimension of the leadership role concerns the family's internal cohesion. The woman who leads informally among the senior female royals is, in practice, the person who holds the most significant responsibility for managing the emotional and relational health of a family. That is, like all families, constantly at risk of allowing the pressures of its particular circumstances to fracture the bonds that hold it together. That responsibility is not exercised through formal authority or official pronouncement. It is exercised through the kind of sustained personal attention to the relationships within the family that requires both the genuine investment of emotional energy and the particular skill of knowing when to intervene in a difficulty and when to allow it to resolve itself without outside pressure. Anne has exercised that responsibility with the particular style that reflects her character: direct, unsparing, and consistently oriented toward the institutional interest rather than the personal comfort of the individuals involved. Catherine's approach to the same responsibility will be, by all accounts of those who have observed her closely, distinctly different in style while remaining consistent in its fundamental orientation toward the health of the institution. Where Anne's interventions have tended toward the direct and the unsentimental, Catherine brings to the management of family relationships a quality of emotional intelligence and personal warmth that those around her identify as one of her most distinctive and most valuable qualities in the context of an institution whose internal relationships have rarely been more strained or more in need of the particular kind of careful, empathetic attention that warmth makes possible. The institution needs both qualities. It has had Anne's for 50 years. It is now, sources say, ready for Catherine's. The obstacles Catherine still faces. There is a particular kind of optimism that surrounds Catherine's emerging position within the royal family, that those who share it would do well to temper with a clear-eyed assessment of what still stands between her and the full consolidation of the leadership role Anne is vacating. The qualities Catherine possesses are genuine, the trajectory she is on is real, and the institutional significance of Anne's deliberate withdrawal from key areas of royal life is not in question. But the British monarchy is not an institution that surrenders its most consequential positions without resistance, and the path between where Catherine currently stands and where Anne's departure is designed to position her runs through a set of obstacles that are as real and as formidable as the qualities that make her the right person to navigate them. Understanding those obstacles is not a counsel of pessimism. It is a prerequisite for understanding what Catherine's leadership will actually cost and what it will require before it can be considered truly secure. The first and most immediately consequential obstacle is the continued presence of Queen Camilla within the royal household. Whatever the current state of Camilla's formal institutional status, and the question of how significantly that status has been altered by recent developments within the palace, remains one that sources discuss with considerable care. She remains physically present, personally connected to the king, and possessed of a depth of experience within the institution that cannot be dismissed as irrelevant simply because the formal architecture of her position has shifted. Camilla has spent decades learning how to exercise influence within the royal world in conditions that were not favorable to her. She navigated years of public hostility, institutional resistance, and the sustained opposition of significant sections of the family with a resilience and a tactical sophistication that the current difficulties she faces have not yet come close to exhausting. The idea that she will quietly retreat from the institutional landscape and leave the space Anne has created for Catherine unchallenged is one that those who know her well describe as wishful thinking of the most dangerous kind. The specific ways in which Camilla's continued presence complicates Catherine's path toward consolidated leadership are both formal and informal in character. On the formal level, the question of precedence within the institution, of whose position within its hierarchy, takes priority in the specific situations where that question matters practically, remains one that the changed landscape of Camilla's status has not entirely resolved. The removal of a title however significant, does not automatically and comprehensively resolve every question about the institutional relationship between the Queen Consort and the Princess of Wales in the specific situations where those questions arise. The conventions that govern royal precedents are ancient, complex, and not always amenable to the kind of clean resolution that straightforward institutional decisions might appear to produce. Sources familiar with the internal dynamics of the household say that the management of those unresolved questions will require from Catherine a degree of careful and sustained navigation that adds a layer of complexity to her institutional position that Anne's generation did not have to manage in the same form. The second obstacle is one that Catherine has spoken about with characteristic honesty in the limited contexts in which she addresses such matters publicly. Her cancer diagnosis and the treatment that followed it were, by the accounts of those closest to her, a far more significant physical experience than the composed manner of her public disclosure suggested to those observing from the outside. The recovery she has made is genuine and is described by those around her as remarkable in its completeness. But a serious illness and its treatment leave traces that are not always visible and that do not always follow the linear trajectory of recovery that public narratives tend to impose on them. The physical demands of the leadership role Anne is creating space for her to fill are considerable. The travel, the sustained public engagement, the emotional labor of managing the family's internal relationships, and the institutional responsibilities that will accumulate around her as her position consolidates are all demands that will test the physical resilience of someone in perfect health. How Catherine manages those demands while attending to the ongoing requirements of her own physical well-being is a question that those around her monitor with the careful attention of people who understand that her health is not simply a personal matter, but an institutional one. The third obstacle is institutional in the broadest sense and concerns the question of readiness that attaches not to Catherine personally, but to the institution's readiness to fully accept her in the role she is moving toward. The royal family, for all the genuine regard that its most senior members have developed for Catherine over the past several years, remains in certain of its dimensions an institution whose instincts are conservative in the particular way of organizations whose identity is inseparable from their history. The role of informal female leader within the family has been associated in the public and institutional imagination with a particular kind of royal woman, one who was born into the institution rather than marrying into it, one whose authority derives from the unquestioned legitimacy of blood and birth rather than from the more contingent legitimacy of demonstrated quality and earned regard. Anne embodies that kind of authority. Catherine does not. Anne never will. And while the evidence of her character and her judgment has done much to bridge the gap between those two kinds of authority, in the perceptions of those around her, the residual distinction has not entirely disappeared, and will not disappear simply because the institutional circumstances now favor her elevation. The fourth obstacle is perhaps the most personal, and in some respects, the most difficult to address directly. It is the obstacle of William himself, not William as an adversary, because he is anything but that in Catherine's institutional life, and not William as an absence, because his support for her is genuine and his understanding of her qualities is clear, but William as a presence whose own institutional trajectory and whose own evolving authority as the future king creates a set of dynamics around Catherine's emerging leadership that she must navigate with the particular care of someone whose personal and institutional relationships with the same individual are inseparably intertwined. The consolidation of Catherine's informal leadership within the family will, as it progresses, increasingly require her to exercise judgments and make decisions that are in some respects independent of William's own institutional position. Finding the precise architecture of that independence within a marriage and a partnership that is also a shared institutional project is a challenge that those around her identify as one of the most nuanced and most consequential she faces on the path toward the role Anne is preparing her for. What this transition means for the monarchy's future. There are transitions within institutions that appear, on their surface, to be about the individuals involved and that reveal themselves, on closer examination, to be about something considerably larger. The shift from Anne's generation to Catherine's within the informal leadership structure of the British royal family is one of those transitions. It is, in its immediate dimensions, the story of two remarkable women and the relationship between them, But in its deeper dimensions, it is the story of a monarchy navigating one of the most consequential generational shifts in its modern history, and doing so under conditions of internal pressure that make the quality of that navigation more important than it has been at any previous point in the current reign. What the transition reveals most clearly about the direction the monarchy is taking is that the institution is in the process of reorienting itself around a center of gravity that is fundamentally different from the one that has defined it for the past generation. Anne's model of royal leadership, rooted in the values of her parents' generation, built on the foundations of unconditional institutional service, and expressed through a style of personal conduct that placed duty above every other consideration, has been the standard against which the behavior of those around her within the institution has been measured for decades. It is a model of extraordinary integrity and extraordinary personal cost. And it is a model whose time, as the primary defining standard of what the monarchy aspires to be, is passing with Anne's gradual withdrawal from the center of its institutional life. Catherine's model is something different. It does not represent a rejection of the values that Anne has embodied. The commitment to genuine service, the seriousness of institutional purpose, and the willingness to carry difficulty without complaint that Catherine has demonstrated are all recognizably continuous with what Anne has always represented. But Catherine brings to those values a set of qualities that belong distinctly to her own generation and her own understanding of what the monarchy needs to be in order to remain meaningful to the people it serves. The emotional accessibility that her public communication reflects, the willingness to engage with the human dimensions of the causes she champions in ways that feel genuinely personal rather than institutionally managed, and the capacity to project warmth without sacrificing the dignity that royal representation requires are all qualities that the monarchy of the next generation will need in its most visible female figure in ways that the monarchy of the previous generation did not. For William's future reign, the significance of Catherine's emerging leadership cannot be overstated. A future king needs, alongside the formal authority of his position, an informal counterpart whose influence within the family and whose public presence within the institution complement and deepen what the formal structures alone can provide. William has in Catherine not simply a partner in the personal sense, but a partner in the fullest institutional sense. Someone whose qualities and whose emerging authority within the family create around the future reign a depth of human credibility that formal power alone can never generate. Anne understood that. It is why she is invested in Catherine with the deliberateness and the generosity that those who have observed the relationship most closely find so striking. She is not simply stepping back. She is ensuring that what she leaves behind is stronger than what she found. The British monarchy has survived centuries of challenge by finding in each generation the people whose qualities matched what the moment required. This moment requires Catherine, and the quiet, deliberate act of an extraordinary woman stepping back to make space for another is perhaps the most eloquent expression of institutional faith that the royal family has produced in years. Is Catherine ready to carry the weight Anne is leaving behind, or are the obstacles still too significant to overcome? The monarchy's future may rest on the answer to that question.